What makes a wild animal wait? Not for food, not for shelter, but to watch. For 21 days, it sat outside the hospital, and no one knew why. The automatic doors of the Mercy Peak Mountain Hospital slid open, releasing a sterile gust of air into the crisp Colorado night. Nurse Sarah Jenkins pulled her jacket tighter. The shift had been brutal. A skier with a shattered femur, a toddler with a fever, the usual mountain town chaos. She just wanted her quiet apartment and a silent cup of tea. But then she saw it. Beyond the last row of cars, on a granite outcrop glowing under the parking lot lights. A bobcat. It sat perfectly still, like a statue carved from the mountain itself. Its tufted ears were erect, its gaze fixed. Not on her, not on the hospital doors. It stared past the building, toward a dark, jagged ridge that clawed at the starry sky. Sarah, a woman who trusted charts and data, felt an unscientific chill. The next night, it was there again. And the night after that. A week passed. The bobcat became a quiet fixture of the night shift. Sarah's logical mind, the one she'd sharpened in the high-pressure emergency rooms of Denver, tried to dismiss it. It was probably hunting rabbits drawn to the hospital lawns. A simple, biological explanation. Yet, it never moved. It just watched. Its target was always the same. The distant, menacing ridge the locals called the Widow's Needle. During a rare lull in the ER, she mentioned it in the break room. Karen Vance, the charge nurse, didn't look up from her scheduling charts. Karen's world was a fortress of protocol and procedure, and a wild animal was an unwelcome variable. "Just make sure no one tries to feed it, Sarah," she said, her tone sharp. "Last thing we need is a rabies scare or a lawsuit." Her dismissal was like a door closing. Before we continue, let us know from which city you are. We are interested to know from where our videos are watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. This gives us motivation to make new and interesting videos. So, let's get started. Dr. Ben Evans, however, leaned forward, the smile lines around his eyes deepening. He was semi-retired, a man who had seen more seasons in these mountains than Sarah had years. A bobcat? Interesting. They're usually so reclusive. He took a sip of his coffee. Nature has its own logic. Sometimes it just takes us a while to understand the language. The other nurses started calling the animal Dr. Bob, a running joke to pass the long hours. But for Sarah, it wasn't funny. She started taking pictures on her phone each night, a collection of grainy images of the same silent watcher, the same intense focus. She felt a strange, growing connection to its vigil, a sense that it was waiting for something, or someone. At the end of the second week, a bulletin appeared on the community board next to the cafeteria. It was a standard missing person flyer. A photograph showed a man with a weathered face and kind, tired eyes, smiling against a backdrop of autumn leaves. Alan Croft, age 58. A tourist from out of state. His rental car had been found at the Junction Creek trailhead days ago. Search and rescue had been deployed. The flyer noted his last known hiking plan was exploring trails in the San Juan National Forest. It was a vast, unforgiving wilderness. The search teams were focusing on the most popular, well-marked paths. Logical, efficient. Sarah stared at the map on the flyer, her heart starting to beat a little faster. The Junction Creek trailhead had dozens of branching paths, but one set of lesser-used trails veered north, directly toward the Widow's Needle. She felt a jolt, a sudden, shocking alignment of facts. The direction of the bobcat's stare, the general area of the missing man. She took the flyer and walked straight to Karen's desk. "Karen, look." She pointed at the map, then gestured out the window toward the dark forest. He's out there, where the bobcat is looking. I think it knows something. Karen gave her a look of profound weariness, the look of a manager dealing with an over-imaginative subordinate. Sarah, with all due respect, you're a fantastic nurse. But you are not a park ranger, and animals are not rescue beacons. SIAR has thermal cameras, dogs, and decades of experience. They know what they're doing. Sarah felt the heat rise in her face. But they're looking in the wrong place. For 2 weeks, that animal hasn't moved. It's not hunting, it's waiting. Karen sighed, her patience snapping. It's a cat, Sarah. A wild animal doing wild animal things. We have 3 ambulances inbound. Drop the fantasy and get back to work. The words stung, leaving Sarah feeling foolish and utterly alone. Her intuition, the part of her she'd suppressed for so long, was screaming. And no one was listening. The 3rd week began with a sense of grim finality. The official SR effort was winding down. The nights were getting colder. The news reports spoke of the search becoming a recovery mission. The window for finding Alan Croft alive was closing. Then, the weather forecast delivered the final blow. A major early-season snowstorm was barreling toward the Rockies. It was due in 48 hours. The snow would bury the trails, erase any tracks, and extinguish the last embers of hope. That night, Sarah saw a change in the bobcat. It was no longer still. It paced the rocky outcrop, a small, frantic circuit of agitation. As Sarah walked to her car after her shift, her body aching with exhaustion and frustration, it stopped. It looked directly at her for the first time. And then it let out a sound she had never heard before. Not a hiss or a growl. It was a low, guttural cry that seemed to tear from its very soul. A sound of desperate urgency. Then, it vanished into the trees. In the sudden silence, Sarah stood frozen. Her logical mind was screaming at her to go home, to forget this madness. But the cry had bypassed her brain and struck something deeper. It wasn't a sound to be analyzed. It was a plea to be answered. She didn't sleep. The bobcat's cry echoed in her silent apartment. She looked at the forecast. She looked at the map. She looked at the picture of Alan Croft's kind face. The cogs of her logical mind, finally, violently, meshed with her intuition. To do nothing was to be complicit. To do nothing was to let a man die because she was afraid of looking like a fool. The next morning, she picked up her phone. She didn't call the sheriff. She didn't call SAR. They wouldn't listen. She called the hospital's staffing line. "This is Sarah Jenkins," she said, her voice steady. "I won't be able to make my shift today. I'm sick." It was a lie, a clean break from the rules that had defined her life. After hanging up, she found Dr. Evans in his office, reviewing patient files. She told him everything. The bobcat, the map, the gut feeling she couldn't shake. He listened without interruption, his gaze thoughtful. He didn't call her crazy. He didn't tell her to stand down. Instead, he opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small, rugged device, a satellite messenger. "If you're going out there," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "you take this. You get into trouble, you press this button. No questions asked." He placed it in her hand. "Trust your gut, Sarah. It's the most underrated diagnostic tool we have." An hour later, her small sedan bumped down a dirt service road that ended near the base of the Widow's Needle. It was as close as she could get. She shouldered her day pack, filled with first aid supplies, water, and protein bars. The air was thin and cold. The silence of the forest was absolute. For the first hour, she felt like a complete idiot. She was a nurse, not a survivalist. Every rustle of leaves made her jump. What was she even looking for? She was following a ghost, a feeling, but she kept the image of the bobcat in her mind, its gaze fixed on the ridge above. She pushed upward, her lungs burning. The terrain grew more hostile, a chaotic jumble of fallen pines and sharp rocks. This wasn't a trail. It was a place people avoided. And then she saw it, a freshly snapped aspen branch at chest height, and below it, a deep scuff mark in the dirt, the kind a boot heel would make in a slip. It wasn't SR orange tape or a trampled path. It was a tiny mistake, a sign of a single person, moving with difficulty. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She wasn't crazy. Someone had been here. Fueled by a surge of adrenaline, she scrambled faster, moving from one barely visible sign to the next. As she cleared a dense thicket of spruce, she looked up at the scree field above her. And there it was. The bobcat. It was sitting on a high ledge, watching her. It held her gaze for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement, before turning and disappearing over the ridge. It wasn't leading her like a dog. It was simply a confirmation. You are in the right place. Keep going. She climbed the final stretch, her hands raw, her legs shaking with effort. As she crested the ridge, a sudden gust of wind hit her. And on that wind, she heard it. Faint, weak, but unmistakable. A human voice. A call for help. She followed the sound down the other side into a narrow, shadowed ravine choked with undergrowth. And there, at the bottom, wedged between two boulders, was Alan Croft. His leg was bent at an impossible angle, the bone a stark white against the bloody fabric of his pants. His face was pale, his lips cracked and blue. He was alive. Barely. Sarah's training took over, a wave of calm efficiency washing away her fear. She slid down the ravine, her first aid kit already open. My name is Sarah. I'm a nurse, she said, her voice clear and steady. I'm going to help you. He looked up, his eyes hazy with pain and delirium. He tried to smile, a weak grimace. He whispered something, his voice a dry rasp. At first, she couldn't understand him. She leaned closer, her ear just inches from his lips, as she reached for the satellite messenger. He whispered again, a little stronger this time. Took you long enough, he rasped. She was getting worried. Sarah dismissed the words as a phantom of the fever. Delirium. The man's mind was broken by pain and isolation. She pushed the SOS button on the satellite messenger. A small green light began to blink, a tiny, steady heartbeat in the growing twilight. Help was coming, but help was not here yet. Okay, Alan, she said, her voice cutting through the silence of the ravine. She was no longer a doubter, no longer a fool. She was an ER nurse, and this was her patient. We need to deal with this leg. She used her trauma shears to carefully cut away the denim, exposing the wound. It was worse than she imagined. The bone had pierced the skin, and the area was swollen and angry. Infection had already set in. His survival so far was a miracle of sheer will. She worked quickly, her movements precise and economical. She cleaned the wound as best she could with her limited supplies. She found 2 sturdy branches and, using climbing tape from her pack, fashioned a crude but effective splint, immobilizing his leg from his ankle to his thigh. He cried out once, a sharp, ragged sound, then fell silent. His pulse was thready, his skin cool and clammy. Shock was setting in. Alan, I need to get some fluids in you. Finding a vein on a severely dehydrated patient in failing light was a challenge that would test a nurse in a brightly lit hospital. Here, it was nearly impossible. She palpated his arm, her fingers searching for the faint bounce of a vein. The first attempt failed. The second failed. "Come on," she whispered to herself. On the third try, she felt the subtle give. She saw the dark flash of blood in the catheter. A wave of profound relief washed over her as she connected the IV bag, letting the life-saving fluid drip into his arm. She draped the emergency mylar blanket over him, its crinkling sound loud in the quiet ravine. The temperature was plummeting. The wind whispered of the coming storm. Now, all they could do was wait. She checked her watch. Minutes felt like hours. She kept talking to Alan, a steady monologue about anything and everything. The hospital, her terrible apartment, the surprisingly good coffee at a local cafe. Anything to tether him to consciousness. Then came the sound, a low, rhythmic thump, thump, thump that seemed to vibrate in her bones before she heard it with her ears. It grew louder, echoing off the rock walls of the ravine. A searchlight sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the trees before locking onto them, bathing them in a brilliant, blinding white light. Sarah shielded her eyes, tears of relief freezing on her cheeks. The helicopter couldn't land in the tight ravine. It hovered above, a furious, roaring beast. A figure descended on a steel cable, a SAR paramedic in a bright orange jumpsuit. He landed beside her with practiced ease, his movements all business. He took in the scene at a glance, the splint, the IV bag, Sarah's exhausted but steady expression. He gave her a single, sharp nod. "Good work, nurse." There was no time for more. The paramedic and his partner on the hoist worked with terrifying speed, packaging Alan into a full-body litter. He was a piece of cargo now, a precious problem to be solved. They hoisted him up, the litter spinning slowly as it rose into the roaring darkness. Then the hoist came back down for her. She clipped herself in, and the ground fell away. For a moment, she was suspended between the dark, unforgiving earth and the loud, brilliant machine of salvation. The wind whipped at her face as she was pulled into the belly of the helicopter. The landing pad at Mercy Peak was a blur of controlled chaos. A gurney was waiting, flanked by an ER team. As they wheeled Alan toward the sliding doors, Sarah saw Karen Vance at the head of the group, a clipboard clutched in her hand. Her face was a mask of stern professionalism. But as the floodlights caught Sarah descending from the helicopter, their eyes met. For one fraction of a second, Karen's mask slipped. Sarah saw shock. She saw disbelief. And she saw a flicker of something she had never seen there before. Raw, unadulterated respect. The trauma bay was a symphony of urgent commands. Unstable compound tib-fib fracture. BP is 90/60, heart rate 130. Pushing another liter of saline, get ortho on the line now. Clothes were cut away. More lines were started. A dozen hands moved over Alan's body. Sarah stood back, her role as a lone rescuer finished. She was now just a witness, caked in dirt and blood, watching her colleagues work. Dr. Evans appeared at her side, placing a warm hand on her shoulder. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. "You did good, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did more than good. Now go get cleaned up. We'll take it from here." Hours later, the hospital had settled into its nighttime rhythm. Alan was out of surgery, his leg pieced back together with plates and screws. He was stable, resting in the second-floor intensive care unit. The storm had finally arrived, snow lashing against the windows. Sarah had showered and changed into clean scrubs, but a restless energy still hummed beneath her skin. She couldn't settle. She found herself walking the quiet hallways, eventually stopping at a large window in the family waiting area. It overlooked the forest. The world outside was a swirling vortex of white. She glanced toward the rocky outcrop, the Bobcat's former vigil point. It was empty, already covered in a blanket of fresh snow. A sense of finality washed over her. It was over. The creature's strange duty was done. Alan was safe, but as she turned to leave, a flicker of movement caught her eye. It wasn't on the outcrop. It was closer, much closer. At the very edge of the tree line, where the manicured hospital grounds met the wild woods. Something was there, partially obscured by the falling snow. It was low to the ground, a familiar silhouette of hunched muscle and pointed ears. As it shifted, 2 points of light caught the glow from the hospital windows. Eyes. The Bobcat was back, but it was no longer looking toward the widow's needle. Its gaze was lifted. It was staring directly at the hospital building, its focus unwavering, aimed at one specific, illuminated window on the second floor. Alan's window. A cold dread, entirely different from the fear she'd felt in the ravine, settled over Sarah. This wasn't logical. It wasn't rational. Animals didn't form attachments to buildings. They didn't hold vigils for strangers. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her fingers fumbling, and tried to zoom in. But the image was a mess of swirling snowflakes and digital noise. The proof was for her eyes only. The Bobcat remained for another hour, a stoic shadow in the blizzard, before melting back into the white chaos of the forest. The mystery wasn't over. It had just changed shape. The next day, the hospital was buzzing. The story of the Bobcat rescue had taken on a life of its own, transforming from break room gossip into a local legend. Sarah was no longer the quiet new nurse from the city. She was a hero. Colleagues who had barely spoken to her before now stopped her in the hall to shake her hand. Patients' families looked at her with awe. It was overwhelming and uncomfortable. She deflected the praise, mumbling about just being in the right place at the right time. But all the while, part of her mind was elsewhere, constantly scanning the tree line from any available window. Karen approached her by the nurse's station, holding out a tablet. Ortho has updated Croft's chart. He's responding well to the antibiotics. Her tone was clipped, all business, but her eyes held a new depth. That was a significant risk you took, Jenkins. It was as close to an apology and a compliment as Karen was capable of giving. He would have died, Sarah replied simply. Karen nodded slowly. I know. The unspoken truce hung in the air between them. Sarah sought out Dr. Evans, finding him reading in the hospital library. Ben, she said, keeping her voice low. It's back, the Bobcat. He was there all night during the storm. Dr. Evans put his book down, giving her his full attention. Where? At the edge of the woods. It's not looking at the ridge anymore. It's looking directly at the ICU, at Alan Croft's room. Dr. Evans leaned back, a slow smile spreading across his face. He didn't look surprised. He looked delighted, like a man seeing his favorite theory proven correct. Well now, he mused. Perhaps the rescue was only the first part of its job. Perhaps it's waiting to make sure we do ours properly. He saw the conflict on Sarah's face. You feel responsible, don't you? Not just for finding him, but for this, for the whole strange story. Sarah nodded, unable to put the swirling emotions into words. Then see it through, he said gently. I'll reassign his primary care. He's your patient now, Sarah, officially. For the next few days, Sarah immersed herself in Alan Croft's recovery. He was her sole focus. She coordinated his medications, changed his dressings, and monitored his vitals with fierce dedication. He was mostly sleeping, recovering from the surgical trauma and fighting off the deep-seated infection. In the quiet moments, When she was alone in the room with the steady beep of the monitors, she would talk to him. She told him about her night on the mountain. She told him about the Bobcat. She told him about its new vigil. "It's out there right now, isn't it?" she whispered to her unconscious patient. "Waiting for you." It felt absurd, confessing her obsession to a sleeping man. But it also felt right. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the world encased in a pristine layer of snow. And every evening, like clockwork, the Bobcat would appear at the tree line, a dark shape against the brilliant white, its gaze fixed on the second-floor window. Alan's condition slowly improved. The fever broke. He began to spend more time awake, though he was often disoriented, lost in a fog of pain medication. During one of these brief, lucid moments, Sarah was changing the dressing on his leg. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at her, but his gaze seemed to be focused on something far away. He mumbled a few words, his voice thick and slurred. "The ear," he whispered. Is the ear okay?" Sarah paused. "Your ear, Alan? Are you hurt?" He shook his head slightly, a flicker of frustration crossing his face, before his eyes closed again and his breathing deepened. He was asleep. Sarah stood frozen for a moment. "The ear? Whose ear?" It was a fragment of a dream, a nonsense phrase from a drugged mind. But it lodged in her brain like a splinter, refusing to be ignored. A week after the rescue, Alan was transferred from the ICU to a regular recovery room. He was awake more, his mind clearer. He was still weak, but he was undeniably on the mend. He was a quiet patient, answering questions politely but offering little else. He seemed wrapped in a private, thoughtful silence. Sarah respected it, continuing her duties with quiet efficiency. She still hadn't mentioned the Bobcat to him. It felt too strange, too fragile a topic to broach with a man still grappling with the enormity of his survival. She didn't want him to think his rescuer was crazy. One afternoon, she was in his room, checking the flow rate on his IV drip. The late sun streamed through the window, making the dust motes dance in the air. Alan had been silent for almost an hour, just watching the light move across the wall. Sarah finished her task and was about to leave. "It has a notch, doesn't it?" His voice was sudden, but perfectly clear. It startled her. Sarah turned around. "I'm sorry, what?" Alan shifted his gaze from the wall and looked directly at her. His tired blue eyes were sharp, focused, and completely lucid. "The one that's been watching," he said, his voice calm and steady. "It has a little notch. In its left ear, right?" The question hung in the air, sharp and impossibly specific. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Her mind, a place of charts and dosages, went completely blank. She could only stare at Alan, whose tired eyes held hers with an unnerving calm. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers clumsy. She scrolled through the gallery, past pictures of her apartment, past screenshots of recipes, to the grainy nighttime photos she had taken. She zoomed in on the clearest one, from the night before the storm. A dark, indistinct shape. But the silhouette of the head was clear against a security light's glow. And there it was, a tiny, unmistakable imperfection on the left ear. A perfect little V-shape, as if clipped by a hole punch. Her hand began to shake. She lowered the phone, unable to speak, and simply nodded. A slow, sad smile spread across Alan Croft's face. He let out a long breath, a sigh that seemed to carry 15 years of weight. "I was a vet," he began, his voice soft. "A wildlife veterinarian, specialized in rehabilitation. It was my whole life." He shifted in the bed, wincing as his leg protested. 15 years ago, not 20 miles from here, I got a call. A hiker found a poacher's snare line. In one of the traps was a mother bobcat. She was gone, but huddled next to her was a single kitten, half-starved, terrified, barely alive. He looked toward the window, as if seeing the memory play out against the glass. The snare wire had caught her ear when she was nursing. It sliced a piece of it clean off. I brought her back to my facility. She was so small I could hold her in one hand. He paused, lost in the memory. I bottle-fed her, cleaned her wound. I named her Echo. Sarah sank into the visitor's chair, her legs suddenly weak. She didn't make a sound, afraid to break the spell. My job, Alan continued, his voice regaining its strength, was not to tame her. It was to prepare her to be wild. I taught her to hunt, to fear humans. It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, to build a bond just to break it. After several months, she was strong, fast, and ready. I brought her back here, to her native territory, and I let her go. He looked back at Sarah, his eyes glistening. I never saw her again, until now. He reached for the small duffel bag SAR had recovered with his belongings. In the side pocket, my camera. Sarah retrieved the old, slightly bulky digital camera. She switched it on. The small screen flickered to life. The first picture was of a mountain peak. The second was of a younger Alan Croft, his face less weathered, his smile just as kind. He was holding a tiny, spotted kitten. One of its ears was bandaged. He was holding a small bottle to its mouth. Sarah clicked to the next photo. The kitten, a little older now, was pouncing on a toy mouse inside a large enclosure. The notch in its left ear was clearly visible. She slowly lowered the camera. The pieces didn't just fall into place. They fused together with the force of a tectonic shift, rearranging her entire understanding of the world. The vigil, the frantic pacing, the desperate cry. It wasn't an animal's strange instinct. It was loyalty. It was memory. Echo hadn't been waiting for just anyone. She had been trying to save her human. She recognized you, Sarah whispered, the words filled with awe. After all this time. When you fell, she must have stayed with you. When she couldn't help, she came to the only other place she knew with humans, the brightest lights in the valley. Alan nodded, a single tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek. She did what I taught her not to do. She came for help. In that moment, the sterile hospital room felt like the most sacred place on earth. The wall between logic and wonder had crumbled completely, and Sarah was standing in the ruins, looking at a truth more profound than any medical chart could ever explain. Later that evening, Sarah found Dr. Evans enjoying the quiet in the hospital chapel. She didn't launch into the story. She simply sat down beside him and showed him the picture on Alan's camera. The vet and the kitten. He looked at it for a long time, then at Sarah's face. He didn't act surprised. He just smiled, a deep, knowing smile. Kindness, he said softly, handing the camera back. It's a form of energy, Sarah. It doesn't just disappear. Sometimes it just takes a while to echo back. The validation from the one person who had believed her was a quiet, powerful comfort. Their relationship changed after that. Sarah and Alan were no longer just nurse and patient. They were keepers of an incredible secret. She would spend hours in his room, not as a caregiver, but as a friend. He told her stories of his work, of releasing eagles, of tracking wolf packs, of the silent, complex world of the wild. In return, she found herself telling him about her burnout in Denver, about the crushing loneliness she'd felt, and the sense of purpose she had lost. He listened, his quiet empathy a healing balm. Alan began physical therapy. His progress was slow but steady. He was determined, pushing himself through the pain with a quiet fortitude that Sarah now understood came from a lifetime of patience. He spent his time reading, sketching the mountains outside his window, and talking with Sarah. The bobcat echo still came. Not every night now, but often enough. Her visits were shorter. She would sit at the tree line, watch the lighted window for a time, and then vanish. It was no longer a frantic plea. It felt more like a check-in, a quiet confirmation. One afternoon, Sarah walked into Alan's room to find him not in bed, but standing with his walker by the window, staring out at the formidable peak of the Widow's Needle. He was looking at it not with fear, but with a look of profound contemplation. He turned as she entered, his expression resolute. He had made a decision. She could see it in his eyes. "Sarah," he said, his voice firm and clear. "I've been on the phone with my family. I've sold them on the idea." He took a steadying breath. "I've told them I'm not going back home." Sarah took a half step back, the firmness in his voice surprising her. "Not going back? But Alan, your home, your family." He smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile that reached his eyes. "They can visit me in a place that has mountains. Sarah, I spent 30 years putting animals back into the wild. Then I retired. I sat in my garden and tried to convince myself that I was content. But I was just waiting. I didn't know for what." He gestured toward the window, toward the vast, snow-covered forest. Lying out there for 2 weeks, with nothing but the sky and the sound of her moving in the brush nearby. It wasn't a near-death experience. It was a wake-up call. I thought my work was done, but the wild wasn't done with me. He explained his plan. The small Durango Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, perpetually underfunded and overwhelmed. He had spoken to the director. His retirement savings, combined with his lifetime of expertise, could transform their operation. He wouldn't just be donating money, he'd be donating himself. "This place saved my life," he said, his voice thick with a new kind of conviction. "Echo saved me. You saved me. How could I just leave? My purpose isn't back there in a quiet suburb. It's right here." Sarah looked at the man before her. Not a victim, but a pioneer on the verge of a new frontier. The isolated, jaded nurse she had been would have questioned the practicality of it all. But the woman standing here now, the one who had followed a bobcat into the wilderness, only felt a profound sense of rightness. "What can I do to help?" she asked. The months that followed were a quiet transformation. Winter's heavy snows melted, feeding the roaring Animas River and breathing green life back into the aspen groves. Alan moved into a small rented cabin on the edge of town, and with the same quiet determination he'd shown in physical therapy, he threw himself into his new role at the Wildlife Center. He built new enclosures, consulted on difficult cases, and mentored the young, passionate staff. His slight limp was a permanent reminder of his ordeal, a physical echo of the event that had given him his life back. Sarah, too, had found her place. The title of hero faded, replaced by a quiet, earned respect. She was no longer the outsider from Denver. She was Sarah, the nurse who listened to her gut. She had found her community not by trying to fit in, but by daring to stand out. Her friendship with Alan became a cornerstone of her new life. They would hike the easier trails on their days off, their conversations flowing easily from medical talk to the silent language of the forest. They never saw Echo. Her presence was felt, a silent guardian in the vast wilderness. But her duty was done. The vigil was over. One warm afternoon in late June, they were walking a trail that followed a babbling creek. The air was rich with the scent of pine and damp earth. Alan, now walking without a cane, moved with a steady, peaceful rhythm. They were talking about a new patient at the hospital, an injured rock climber, when Alan suddenly stopped. He put a hand on Sarah's arm, silencing her. He didn't point. He just looked. Sarah followed his gaze. Across the creek, on a large, sun-drenched granite boulder, a bobcat was sitting. It was grooming its paw, seemingly oblivious to them. Then it lifted its head, and its golden eyes met theirs. The notched left ear was unmistakable. It was Echo. There was no fear in her eyes, no agitation, just a calm, level assessment. It wasn't the look of a pet acknowledging its owner. It was the gaze of a sovereign creature, acknowledging a connection that transcended species. The three of them stood frozen in a silent tableau for a long minute. The rescuer, the rescued, and the savior. Then, as silently as she had appeared, Echo turned, leapt from the boulder, and vanished into the dense green undergrowth. She was gone. Alan let out a slow breath. He looked at Sarah, his eyes shining. "Thank you," he said. And she knew he wasn't just thanking her for the rescue. He was thanking her for believing in the impossible. Sarah looked from Alan's peaceful face to the spot where Echo had disappeared, then up at the vast, blue Colorado sky. The feeling wasn't the frantic adrenaline of the rescue, nor the awe of the revelation. It was a deep, quiet sense of peace, a feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She had come to these mountains seeking an escape, a quiet place to hide. Instead, she had found a home, a purpose, and a friend. And she had learned that the wildest, most unbelievable things in the world weren't ghosts or fantasies, but the powerful, unseen echoes of a simple act of kindness. Do you believe Echo's actions were purely instinct, or a conscious act of loyalty?